The message arrived at exactly 6 in the morning, Earth Standard Time. Ambassador Daniel Carter was already awake, sitting in his small office aboard the diplomatic vessel Horizon's Edge, drinking his third cup of coffee and reading reports from the outer colonies. When the priority alert flashed across his screen, he set down his cup and leaned forward. The Galactic Council had finally agreed to vote on humanity's full membership application. After 15 years of waiting, 15 years of being treated as second-class observers, the moment had come. Daniel read the message twice, then a third time. The vote would take place in 7 days on the Sera Prime, ancient homeworld of the species that had founded the Council 12,000 years ago. He was required to appear before the full assembly to present humanity's case. He sat back in his chair and let out a long breath. This was everything he had worked for. His entire career, 40 years of diplomatic service, had been leading to this single moment. He had negotiated trade agreements with species that communicated through color changes. He had resolved border disputes between empires that had been fighting for centuries. He had learned 17 alien languages and studied the customs of more than 100 different cultures. All of it had been preparation for this. Lieutenant. Amy Turner knocked on his door 20 minutes later. She was young, barely 30, but she had proven herself to be one of the sharpest minds in the diplomatic corps. Daniel had personally requested her as his aide for this mission. She asked if he had seen the message. Her face was carefully neutral, but Daniel could see the excitement in her eyes. He nodded and gestured for her to sit down. They spent the next hour going over the details. The council chamber would be filled with representatives from 47 species. Each one would have a vote. A simple majority was required for acceptance, but traditionally, new members were admitted only with overwhelming support. Anything less was seen as a sign of weakness. Daniel knew that humanity had friends on the council. The Valkyrie respected human military discipline. The small trading species called the Phoenix had grown wealthy. Through commerce with Earth, even the reclusive Mendari had expressed cautious approval of human scientific achievements. But there were also enemies. Species that saw humanity as a threat. Species that feared what humans might become if given full access to galactic technology and resources. And then there was High Arbiter VONN-KEL. Amy pulled up the file on Von Kell and displayed it on the wall screen. The Fesseran leader was ancient by any standard, over 800 years old. He had guided the Council through 3 major crises, and was widely considered the most influential political figure in the galaxy. He was also deeply suspicious of humanity. Daniel studied the image on the screen. Von Kell was tall and thin, with pale blue skin and eyes that seemed to look through whatever he focused on. His species had evolved on a peaceful world with no natural predators. They had never known war, never experienced violence on a large scale. To them, humanity's bloody history was incomprehensible. The journey to the Sera Prime would take 3 days at maximum speed. Daniel ordered the ship to depart immediately, then retreated to his quarters to prepare. He did not sleep much during those 3 days. Instead, he worked. He reviewed every speech he had ever given, looking for phrases that had resonated with alien audiences. He studied recordings of previous membership votes, noting which arguments had succeeded and which had failed. He practiced his presentation until he could deliver it perfectly in 7 different languages. Amy checked on him regularly, bringing food that he mostly ignored and updates that he absorbed without comment. She was worried about him. He could tell. He was pushing himself too hard. But this was not the time to hold back. On the 2nd day, a new message arrived. It was a leaked document, passed along through unofficial channels by a contact in the Phoenix delegation. Daniel read it with growing horror. Von Unkel had been busy. For months, perhaps years, he had been circulating a report among the council members. The report was titled Assessment of Human Civilization, and it was devastating. Every dark chapter of human history was laid out in careful detail. The wars, the genocides, the weapons of mass destruction, the environmental damage, the cruelty that humans had inflicted on each other. Throughout their existence, the report concluded that humans were too dangerous to be trusted with full membership. They were to be classified as a war-fearing species, a term that Daniel had never heard before. He searched the galactic databases and found only 3 other species with that classification. All 3 had destroyed themselves within a century of first contact. Amy found him staring at the report, his face pale. She read it over his shoulder and then said something that surprised him. She told him that they should not try to deny it. They should not make excuses or pretend that human history was something other than what it was. Instead, they should own it. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. She was right. The Council already had all the evidence they needed to condemn humanity. Denying it would only make them look dishonest. Their only chance was to change the meaning of that evidence. The horizon's edge arrived at the Sara Prime on the morning of the 7th day. Daniel stood at the observation window and watched as the planet grew larger in the viewport. It was a beautiful world, covered in silver oceans and purple forests. The Thesserans had never polluted their environment, never strip-mined their resources, never done any of the things that humans had done to Earth before they learned better. A shuttle carried them down to the surface. The spaceport was enormous, designed to accommodate species of all sizes and shapes. Daniel saw creatures that towered 3 stories tall walking alongside beings. So small they traveled in hover chairs to avoid being stepped on. The air smelled strange, filled with scents his human nose could not identify. The council chamber was located in the center of the capital city, a massive structure that had stood for 10,000 years. Daniel paused at the entrance and looked up at the towering doors. They were carved with symbols representing each member's species. There was no symbol for humanity. Not yet. Inside, the chamber was dark and vast. Rows of seats rose up into the shadows, arranged in a great circle around a central platform. This was where petitioners stood to address the council. This was where Daniel would make his case. He walked to the platform and stood in the single beam of light that illuminated it. Around him, in the darkness, he could hear the sounds of alien beings settling into their seats. Whispers in languages he did not understand, the rustle of strange appendages, the hum of translation devices activating. Amy took her place in the observation gallery, along with a small group of human support staff. She caught his eye and gave him a small nod of encouragement. Then the lights came up, and Daniel saw them. 47 species, hundreds of individuals, all staring down at him with expressions he could not read. Some looked curious. Some looked hostile. Most looked indifferent, as if his presence was barely worth noticing. High Arbiter Von Chell sat in an elevated seat at the front of the chamber, his pale eyes fixed on Daniel with an intensity that made the ambassador's skin prickle. There was no warmth in that gaze. No welcome. Only cold assessment. The vote was about to begin, and Daniel Carter, representative of all humanity, stood alone in the light. High Arbiter Von Chell rose from his seat with the slow grace of a creature that had never needed to hurry in its entire life. His elongated body unfolded to its full height, casting a long shadow across the chamber floor. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried to every corner of the vast room through the translation systems embedded in the walls. He welcomed the assembly, thanked them for gathering to consider the petition of the human species. His tone was polite, formal, completely neutral, but Daniel had studied enough diplomatic encounters to recognize the danger beneath those calm words. Von Chell began by acknowledging humanity's achievements. He spoke of their rapid technological development, their expansion into space, their success in establishing peaceful relations with several council species. He even praised their art and music, which had become surprisingly popular on certain worlds. Then his tone shifted. He told the assembly that, before they could make a decision, they needed to understand what humans truly were, not the polished diplomats who had visited their worlds, not the traders who had brought them interesting goods. They needed to see the truth that humans kept hidden. A holographic display activated in the center of the chamber. Images began to appear, floating in the air where everyone could see them. Daniel felt his stomach clench as he recognized what was being shown. The first images were from ancient history. Armies clashing on blood-soaked fields. cities burning, bodies piled in mass graves. The conquest of empires, the fall of civilizations, the endless cycle of violence that had defined human existence for thousands of years. VONN-KEL narrated each image in that same soft voice. He explained how humans had enslaved each other, tortured each other, committed atrocities against their own kind that most council species could barely comprehend. He showed them the ruins of Carthage, salted so that nothing would ever grow there again. He showed them the killing fields, Cambodia, the gas chambers of the Holocaust. The atomic shadows burned into the streets of Hiroshima. The chamber grew quiet. Daniel could hear sounds of distress from some of the delegates. A species called the Luminara, who communicated through patterns of light, had gone completely dark. The Phoenix ambassador had covered his eyes with his small hands, but Vanchel was not finished. He moved on to more recent history, the world wars that had killed hundreds of millions, the weapons that humans had created, bombs that could destroy entire cities in a single flash, chemical agents that caused victims to drown in their own lungs, biological weapons designed to spread plague across continents. He showed them the nuclear arsenals that still existed on Earth. Thousands of warheads, enough to destroy their own planet many times over. He asked the assembly to consider what kind of species built such weapons. What kind of species kept them ready to use at a moment's notice? Daniel stood in silence, his hands clasped behind his back. He had known this was coming. He had prepared himself for it. But seeing humanity's darkest moments displayed before the entire galaxy was harder than he had expected. He felt shame burning in his chest. Mixed with a growing anger that he struggled to control, Vonkel turned off the display and faced the assembly directly. He told them that the evidence was clear. Humans were a violent species, perhaps the most violent the galaxy had ever encountered. Their entire history was a record of bloodshed. Their technology had been developed primarily for war. Even their entertainment glorified conflict and death. He paused, letting his words sink in. Then he delivered his verdict. Humans, he declared, should be classified as a war-fearing species. The term drew gasps from several delegations. Daniel saw the Valkyrie ambassador lean forward with a frown. Even species that had expressed reservations about humanity seemed surprised by the harshness of the classification BON, and Kell explained the reasoning. War-fearing species were those so traumatized by their own violence that they had developed a deep psychological fear of conflict. This fear made them unstable, unpredictable. They might appear peaceful for generations, but eventually something would trigger them. Their buried violence would erupt without warning, destroying everything around them. This was why war-fearing species could never be trusted with full council membership. They were too dangerous. Their fear of war made them more likely to start one, not less. History had proven this again and again. He called for a vote on the classification. If it passed, humanity would be permanently barred from membership. They would remain observers, tolerated but never accepted, until they either evolved beyond their violent nature or destroyed themselves as other war-fearing species had done. Daniel watched as the voting began. Small lights appeared before each delegation, ready to record their decisions. The Thesserons voted yes immediately. Several other species followed. The Luminara, still dark with distress, voted yes. The small amphibian species called the Mara voted yes without hesitation. The Valkyrie abstained. The Phoenix voted no. But it was not enough. One by one, the lights turned from neutral white to the blue of approval. Classification was going to pass. In the observation gallery, Lieutenant Commander Kevin Walsh gripped the railing so hard that his knuckles turned white. He had served in the human military for 20 years. He had seen friends die protecting colonies that belonged to some of the species now voting against them. He had risked his life to rescue Mora civilians from a pirate attack 3 years ago. And now the Mora were voting to condemn his entire species as dangerous savages. Amy Turner stood beside him, her face pale but composed. She was watching Daniel, waiting to see what he would do. She had worked with him for 5 years. She knew he had a plan. He always had a plan, the vote concluded. 31 species in favor, 12 opposed for abstentions. The classification passed. Von Unkeld announced the result with what might have been satisfaction. Though his alien features were difficult to read, humanity was officially designated a war-fearing species. Their application for membership was denied. They were advised to return to their own territory and work on addressing their psychological issues. Perhaps in a few centuries, they could try again. The chamber began to buzz with conversation. Several delegates were already rising from their seats, ready to move on to other business. The human petition had been dealt with. It was over. But Daniel Carter had not moved. He stood in the center of the chamber, in that single beam of light, and waited. The noise gradually died down as species noticed that he was still there. One by one, they turned to look at him. Von Unkeld frowned. He asked if the human ambassador had something to say. His tone suggested that whatever Daniel might say would be pointless. The vote had been taken. The decision was final. Daniel looked up at the High Arbiter. When he spoke, his voice was calm and clear. He asked for the right of response. Under Council rules, any petitioner whose application was denied had the right to address the Assembly one final time before departing. It was an old tradition, rarely used, but it was still valid. Venchel hesitated. For a moment, it seemed like he might refuse. But too many eyes were watching. Too many species would notice if he violated the ancient protocols. He granted the request with a wave of his thin hand. The human could speak. Then he would leave. Daniel nodded once. He took a deep breath. And he began. Daniel Carter stood in silence for a long moment, letting the weight of attention settle over him. Every eye in the chamber was focused on his small figure in the center of the room. Some watched with curiosity, wondering what the condemned human would say. Others watched with impatience, eager to move on to more important matters. A few watched with something like pity. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. So quiet that beings in the upper rows had to lean forward to hear him through their translation devices. He thanked the High Arbiter for the opportunity to respond. He thanked the Council for taking the time to consider humanity's application. He said that he understood their concerns. Truly did. Then he paused and looked around the chamber, meeting as many eyes as he could. He told them that everything Von Unkeld had shown them was true. Every image of war, every record of atrocity, every weapon of destruction. It was all real. Humans had done those things. Humans had killed each other in numbers that defied comprehension. Humans had created weapons, capable of ending their own civilization. He was not there to deny any of it. Several delegates exchanged confused glances. They had expected the human to make excuses, to explain away the violence. To claim that the images had been taken out of context. That was what petitioners usually did. But this human was admitting everything. Daniel continued. He said that human history was written in blood. From the very beginning, from the moment their ancestors first picked up stones and sticks, humans had been fighting. Fighting for territory, fighting for resources, fighting for power, fighting for ideas, sometimes fighting for no reason at all, except that fighting was what they knew. He walked slowly across the platform as he spoke, his footsteps echoing in the silent chamber. He told them that humans had invented new ways to kill each other with terrible creativity. Swords and spears, guns and cannons, bombs that could level cities, poisons that could kill millions. They had studied death the way other species studied art or music. They had become experts in destruction. The Luminara had begun to glow faintly again, their lights pulsing with distress. The Mara ambassador was shaking his head slowly, as if confirming his earlier vote. Even the Valkyrie, who prided themselves on their warrior culture, seemed uncomfortable with the human's blunt confession. But then Daniel's voice changed. It grew stronger, steadier, filled with something that had not been there before. He asked the assembly to consider something. He asked them to think about what it meant that humans were still here. The chamber went very quiet. Daniel pointed out that humans had invented nuclear weapons nearly 100 years ago. They had built enough of them to destroy their planet many times over, and yet Earth was still there. Humanity was still alive. They had not destroyed themselves. He asked how many species in that chamber could say the same. How many had developed weapons capable of ending their own existence? How many had faced that choice and survived? No. One answer Daniel told them that humans had come to the edge of extinction more than once. During something called the Cold War, two great nations had pointed thousands of nuclear missiles at each other. For decades, the entire species had lived under the shadow of instant annihilation. One mistake, one misunderstanding, one moment of madness, and everything would have ended. But it did not end. Humans chose not to destroy themselves. They pulled back from the edge, not because they were incapable of violence, because they decided that survival mattered more. He began to walk among the lower rows of delegates, speaking directly to them rather than addressing the chamber as a whole. Some species shifted uncomfortably at his approach. Others met his gaze with interest. He asked them if they knew what happened after the Great Wars. He told them about the treaties that were signed, international organizations that were created, the laws that were written to prevent such horrors from happening again. He told them about the soldiers who became peacekeepers, the scientists who turned from weapon in S2 medicine, the leaders who chose negotiation over conquest. He told them about the ordinary humans who had refused to participate in evil, the people who had hidden refugees in their homes at risk of their own lives, the soldiers who had disobeyed orders to commit atrocities, the doctors who had treated enemy wounded on the battlefield, the countless small acts of courage and compassion that never made it into the history books. Daniel stopped in front of the Mara delegation. He looked directly at their ambassador, a small amphibian creature with large, frightened eyes. He asked if the ambassador remembered the attack on Mora Station 3 years ago. Pirates had raided a Mora colony on the Outer Rim. They had taken hostages. They had threatened to kill everyone unless their demands were met. The Mara ambassador nodded slowly, clearly unsure where this was going. Daniel told him that a human military vessel had been the first to respond. Lieutenant Commander Kevin Walsh had led a team of 12 humans into that station. They had fought their way through the pirates, risking their lives to rescue strangers. 3 humans had died in that operation. 3 humans who had no connection to the Mara, no obligation to help. There's no reason to be there except that innocent people were in danger. He pointed toward the observation gallery, where Kevin Walsh was standing. The lieutenant commander's face was hard, his jaw clenched. He had not known that Daniel would mention the rescue. Daniel asked the Mara, "Ambassador, if that seemed like the action of a war-fearing species, did humans who were traumatized by violence run toward danger to save people they had never met?" The ambassador did not answer. He could not meet Daniel's eyes. Daniel turned back to the center of the chamber. His voice rose, filling the vast space with a power that seemed too large for his small human body. He told them that Von Schell was right about one thing. Humans did fear war. They feared it deeply, more than any species that had never experienced it could possibly understand. They feared it because they knew exactly what it cost. They had counted the bodies. They had mourned the dead. They had rebuilt from the ashes again and again. But that fear had not made them weak. It had made them determined. Determined to do better. Determined to build a future where their children would not have to fight the same wars their parents had fought. He looked up at Von Schell, who was watching him with an expression that might have been surprise. He told the High Arbiter that humans were not war-fearing. They were war-knowing. And there was a very important difference. The silence in the chamber had changed. It was no longer the polite silence of an audience waiting for a speaker to finish. It was the tense silence of beings who were actually listening, actually thinking about what they were hearing. Daniel Carter stood in the center of the light and looked round at the assembled species. He could see doubt on some faces, anger on others. The Valkyrie ambassador had leaned forward in his seat, his sharp eyes fixed on Daniel with intense interest. The Phoenix were nodding to each other. Even some of the species that had voted against humanity seemed uncertain now. But Van Kel's expression had not changed. The High Arbiter sat in his elevated seat, watching Daniel with those pale, ancient eyes. He did not seem impressed. Daniel decided it was time to stop defending and start attacking. He turned to face the Thesseron delegation directly. He asked them a simple question. He asked how their species had achieved peace. Van Chel frowned slightly. He answered that the Thesserons had always been peaceful. It was their nature. They had evolved on a world without predators. without competition, without the pressures that drove other species to violence. Daniel nodded. He thanked the High Arbiter for confirming what he had suspected. The Thesserons had never faced a choice. They had never been tested. They had no idea what it meant to choose peace when war was an option. The chamber buzzed with murmurs. Several Thesseran delegates shifted in their seats, clearly offended. But Daniel was already moving on. He turned to the Valkyrie. Everyone knew the Valkyrie were proud warriors. Their culture celebrated combat. Their history was filled with great battles and legendary fighters. They had earned respect throughout the galaxy for their martial prowess. Daniel asked their ambassador a question. He asked how many civil wars the Valkyrie had fought in the last 1,000 years. The Valkyrie ambassador hesitated. His fierce features twisted with something that might have been embarrassment. Finally, he answered. 17. Daniel repeated the number loudly enough for the entire chamber to hear. 17 civil wars in 1,000 years. The Valkyrie, who considered themselves noble warriors, had spent centuries slaughtering each other over territory and honor and ancient grudges. He asked how many. Valkyrie had died in those conflicts. The ambassador did not answer. He did not need to. Everyone could see the shame in his eyes. Daniel moved on to the Mendari. They were a quiet species, known for their scientific achievements and their peaceful society. Their world had not seen violence in over 3,000 years. Many considered them a model of civilization. He asked how they had achieved that peace, the Mendari ambassador. A tall being with silver skin and no visible eyes answered in a soft voice. They had modified themselves. Genetic engineering had removed the capacity for aggression from their species. They had cut out the parts of their brain that produced violent impulses. Daniel let that answer hang in the air for a moment. Then he asked if that was truly peace, or if it was just surrender. The Mendari had not learned to control their violent nature. They had simply destroyed it. They had made themselves incapable of fighting, even in self-defense. He asked what would happen if the Mendari were attacked. What would happen if an enemy came to their world with weapons and hostile intent? Would they be able to defend themselves? Would they be able to protect their children? The Mendari ambassador had no answer. Daniel turned to the Kreth collective. They were not a single species, but a group of beings connected by a shared consciousness. They had no individual thoughts, no personal desires, no separate identities. Everything they did was decided by the whole. He asked if they considered that peace. The Kreth had eliminated conflict by eliminating choice. There were no wars in the collective because there was no one left to disagree. Every mind thought the same thoughts, felt the same feelings, wanted the same things. He asked if that was the kind of peace the Council wanted for the galaxy. A peace where everyone was the same, where different opinions did not exist, where the very concept of individuality had been erased. The Kreth did not respond. They never responded to individual questions. They only spoke when the collective reached consensus, which could take hours or days. Daniel walked back to the center of the platform. His voice had grown stronger with each species he challenged. Now it rang through the chamber like a bell. He told them that humans had done something none of these species had done. Humans had kept their aggression. They had kept their individuality. They had kept their capacity for terrible violence. And they had learned to control it, not through genetic modification, not through hive minds, not through the luck of evolving on a peaceful world. They had done it through choice, through effort, through the accumulated wisdom of generations who had seen the worst of what humans could do and decided, together, to do better. He told them that every human carried the potential for violence within them. Every human could pick up a weapon and use it. Every human had the ability to hate, to fear, to destroy. But most humans chose not to. Most humans chose to build instead of burn. Most humans chose love over hate, peace over war, cooperation over conflict. That choice was what made humanity special. That choice was what made them strong. He pointed at Von Kell. His voice was hard now. It's almost angry. He asked the High Arbiter to consider what it meant that humans had survived their own violent nature. Other species had destroyed themselves. Other species had modified themselves beyond recognition. Other species had surrendered their freedom to achieve peace. Humans had done none of those things. They had kept everything that made them dangerous, and they had learned to be better anyway. Not because they were incapable of war, but because they had seen its cost and chosen a different path, he told Von Schell that humans did not need the Council's approval to be proud of what they had accomplished. They did not need alien validation to know their own worth. They had earned their place among the stars, not despite their violent history, but because of what they had learned from it. Susan Price watched from the human delegation booth, tears streaming down her face. She had spent her entire career studying alien cultures, trying to find common ground, trying to help humanity fit into the galactic community. She had never heard anyone defend human history so passionately beside her. Kevin Walsh stood at attention, his earlier anger transformed into something else. Pride. He was proud to be human. Proud to be part of a species that had seen the darkness and still reached for the light. In the chamber below, Daniel Carter stood alone in the center of the light, but he did not look alone anymore. He looked like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Daniel Carter took a step forward, then another. He was walking toward Von Schell's elevated platform, breaking every protocol of the council chamber. Security drones hummed to life around the edges of the room, their weapons systems activating with soft clicks. Von Schell raised one thin hand. The drones stopped. The High Arbiter was watching Daniel with an expression that no one in the chamber had ever seen on his ancient face. It was uncertainty. Daniel stopped at the base of the platform. He looked up at the being who had just condemned his entire species. His voice was calm now, almost conversational. But every word carried the weight of centuries. He asked Von Schell a question. He asked what the Council would do when the outer regions descended into chaos. Not if, when. Because Daniel had studied galactic history. He had read the reports that the Council kept classified. He knew that the peace of the last few thousand years was an illusion. There were empires on the rim that were growing restless. There were ancient enemies that would not stay buried forever. There were forces in the darkness between stars that even the Council did not fully understand. Sooner or later, the peace would break. It always did. He asked who they would call when that happened. Who would they turn to when diplomacy failed and force became necessary? He pointed to the Thesseron delegation, what they call the Thesserons, who had never known conflict, who had no concept of how to fight or why anyone would want to. A species that had achieved peace by accident of evolution was not equipped to defend it. He pointed to the Mendari, what they call a species that had cut out their own ability to fight. When enemies came with weapons and hostile intent, would the Mendari stand in their way with their modified brains and their peaceful thoughts? He pointed to the Kreth Collective, what they call a hive mind that took days to reach any decision. In war, battles were won and lost in seconds. The Kreth would still be deliberating when their cities burned. The chamber was completely silent. Daniel's words echoed off the ancient walls and faded into darkness. He turned slowly, looking at each delegation in turn. He asked them to think carefully about what they were doing. They were pushing away the one species in the galaxy that actually knew how to fight. The one species that had developed the art of war to levels no other civilization had reached. The one species that could protect them when the darkness came. And why? Because humans scared them. Because human history was violent. Because humans had done terrible things to each other before learning to do better. He told them that they should be scared. Not of what humans might do, but of what would happen without them. He walked back to the center of the platform. His final words were spoken quietly, but they silenced even the whispers of the translation devices. He told them that humanity did not need the Council's approval. They would continue doing what they had always done, would protect the innocent. They would oppose tyranny, would stand against the darkness wherever it appeared. Not because they were incapable of violence, not because they had engineered away their aggression, not because they had surrendered their individuality to a collective. They would do it because they had seen violence, they had lived it, they had survived it, and they had chosen something better. He told them that the most dangerous warriors were not those who loved war. They were those who hated it enough to become very good at ending it. Then he turned and walked toward the exit. His footsteps echoed through the silent chamber, did not look back. Amy Turner was waiting for him at the observation gallery entrance. She fell into step beside him without a word. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her face was fierce with pride. Kevin Walsh and Susan Price followed close behind. The small group of humans walked through the ancient corridors of the council building, past statues of species that had risen and fallen over 12,000 years. No one tried to stop them. No one said anything at all. Behind them, the chamber erupted. The Valcor ambassador was the first to speak. He demanded that the vote be reconsidered. The classification of warfearing was inappropriate. It was an insult. To a species that had demonstrated more self-control than any other in the galaxy, the Phoenix delegation immediately supported the motion. They had traded with humans for 15 years. They knew humans were not savages. They were partners. They were friends. The Luminara began to flash with complex patterns of light. Their translation device struggled to keep up, but the meaning was clear. They wanted to change their vote. They had been wrong. Even the Mara ambassador was shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He had voted against humanity without really thinking about it. But Daniel's reminder of the station rescue had forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. Humans had died for his people. How could he call them monsters? Von Schell tried to restore order. He insisted that the vote was final, that the rules were clear, that they could not simply change their minds because one human had given a passionate speech. But no one was listening to him anymore. 3 species formally requested bilateral discussions with Earth's government. The Valkyrie wanted to establish military exchange programs. The Phoenix wanted to expand trade agreements, even the reclusive. Mendari expressed interest in studying human psychology, hoping to understand how they had controlled their aggression without genetic modification. The vote to classify humans as warfearing was suspended, pending further review. It was an unprecedented move. In 12,000 years of council history, no verdict had ever been overturned so quickly. Outside the chamber, Daniel Carter stood in the silver light of the Thessaran sun. He looked up at the purple sky and allowed himself a small smile. Amy asked him if he had known his speech would work. Had he planned the whole thing from the beginning? Daniel shook his head, told her that he had no idea if it would work. He had simply told the truth. Sometimes that was enough. The Horizon's Edge lifted off from the Sarah Prime 3 hours later. As the ship climbed toward orbit, Daniel stood at the observation window and watched the planet shrink behind them. He had not won full membership for humanity. It would take more time, more negotiations, more patience. But he had done something more important. He had shown the galaxy what humans really were. Not perfect beings, not peaceful by nature, but something better. A species that had every reason to destroy itself and had chosen not to. A species that had looked into the abyss of its own violence and had built bridges over it instead of falling in. A species that understood war better than anyone and hated it more because of that understanding. Somewhere behind him, in the council chamber, the universe was learning a new truth. Humans were not war-fearing. They were war-knowing, and that made all the difference. The ship jumped too faster than light speed, carrying its crew back toward Earth, back toward home, back toward a species that was still learning, still growing, still becoming whatever they would eventually be. Daniel Carter sat down in his office and began writing his report. There was still work to do. There was always work to do. But for the first time in 15 years, he felt like humanity had a real chance. The galaxy had finally started to understand.